Hello, everyone. My name is Homero de Zúñiga. I'm a distinguished research professor at the University of Salamanca. I'm also a distinguished professor at Pennsylvania State University and a senior research fellow at Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. It is an authentic pleasure to participate once more on this Convergent Content Research Center International Conference. This is the third annual conference, so it's fantastic news that the conference continues to progress every year. And I want to also thank Sungkyunkwan University for putting together such a fantastic program for this year and to also invite me to be a participant once more. The paper that I'm going to discuss today is a collaboration from two of my PhD students in Pennsylvania State University that I would like to also bring to your attention and give them due credit. Ryan Wan, who's a PhD candidate at Penn State University, and also Chang, who is a doctoral student as well at the Department of Media Studies. And the paper, we set the title of Selective Exposure to News, Homogeneous Political Discussion Networks and Affective Political Polarization. And in reality, what we wanted to address with this is an increasingly growing problem that takes place at many different societies, although the focus of the research is in the US. I think that in many other societies, we are also experiencing this increased level of affective political polarization. And we wanted to learn more about what is it that triggers this polarization and sustains the polarization over time, because there's a lack of research in that respect. So first, why did we use agent-based modeling to advance the research in this area? We have certain evidence, both based on experiments and also survey, about the fact that affective polarization is taking place. And I would show very soon a slide in which we can see polls, public opinion polls, and we can keep track as for how this affective polarization is going over time in the US. But as much as we have some evidence that this is taking place, what we don't know, or the level of granularity that survey research and experiments may lack, is the process of how this happens, and therefore allowing us a little space of understanding as for how we can combat or diminish the increase of polarization in society. So agent-based modeling, by studying at the micro level dynamics of how agents interact with each other, would to some extent provide us this light, or more focused light on the process itself. And that is precisely what we wanted to advance with this study. There is some evidence as for how agent-based modeling have helped already communication scholars to hone some of lines of research that are important, like for instance, dynamics of public opinion, or how a spiral of silence develops and works, as well as the processes by which individuals may correct misinformation or fake news, and also certain initial work on the process of affective polarization by Chung and Gardner. So we take that line of research and we advance it along the lines of affective polarization within the scope of both selective exposure to information and also having homogeneous discussions online, and how that may affect political polarization, affective polarization over time. So what's affective polarization? The most commonly utilized operationalization of this construct is this individual's hostility towards the opposed either political party or political figures in reference to one's or one's ideological or in-group political party or political leaders. And usually this has been measured by a feeling thermometer, in which we can gauge individuals' feelings towards the in-party or in-party leaders, as opposed to out-party and out-party leaders. This is a very visual graph on the growth of affective polarization over time in the US, provided by Dragman and Levy. And it's very revealing because we can see that obviously across time, the in-group feeling is above that of conceded to the out-group feelings. That means that individuals, they tend to rate higher and have a more positive feeling towards the in-party or the in-party leaders as opposed to the out-party or leaders. But what we can see is that the affective polarization levels have been increasing over time. So yes, across time, for decades, consistently people evaluate better and have a positive feeling towards the in-party as opposed to the out-party. But that gap, that distance between the in-party and the out-party increases over year, as you can see, is at the highest rate in the 2020s. So what we know then is that media effects have been consistently linked to this idea of affective polarization. And bringing that idea and combining that idea to other theoretical rationales that have been proposed for the past decade, we wanted to explore not only the process, as I said in the beginning, of affective polarization, how it happens, but also since we can simulate with these agents different societies, we created two independent different societies, a society in which the effects of the media are minimal, which that debate was proposed initially, taking the ideas of Lasserfeld back in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, of media effects strong versus minimal media effects comparisons. Lance Bennett and Santo Iyengar, they started to discuss this idea that we might be embarked in a minimal persuasion era in which media may not affect individuals so much. To that provoking, thoughtful piece, Lance Hover and colleagues, Lance Hover, Kelly Garrett, and others, they propose the idea that we should look this differently, because what happens is that some of the media effects might be reinforcing one's attitudes or political attitudes, and that is a strong effect. It's just that you might not be persuaded, but you are persuaded to become more polarized or become more attitudinally reinforced towards your own viewpoints or your own ideology. And that's problematic because what happens is that it generates a stronger attitude, right? So that was the response. Well, whichever the case, we can test that. And that's precisely what we do in this study. We generate over the course of 48 months, a period that happens between one general election and the next, 4 years, 48 months. We created two different societies, a society in which there's a strong media effect as opposed to a society that we will have minimal media effects in which the media will not affect people so much. In any case, what we do know is that depending on what messages people are exposed to and with whom they discuss politics, all these things matter. And that's why having different testings in society types or media effects types, strong versus minimal societies, will be also important to see what happens if we find differences. So what two main antecedents we would like to pay attention in this study with regard affective polarization? The two main antecedents that we pay attention to are selective media exposure and homogeneous political discussion, which are the two main culprits of affective polarization. The selective media exposure is the classic idea proposed by Talia Stroud and also Kelly Garrett and other colleagues, in which they talk about this idea that people will purposefully get exposed to news outlets and media that aligns with their political views. So individuals selectively get to be exposed to information and news that align with their political inclination. Similarly, homogeneous political discussions take place when individuals also choose to just maintain conversations and political discussions with those who agree with them or have very similar views. And therefore, they generate the so-called echo chambers of discussion. If you put these two things together, what you're generating, in fact, is an homogeneous bubble of homophilic media and discussion, right? So we wanted to learn several things from this, like how is the process, how it works over the period of 4 years, but also are there differences? not only in minimal versus strong era societies, but also between these two things. What matters more, if anything, is selective media exposure more important at time to predict affective polarization than just having conversations with people who think similarly to you, or vice versa. Actually, having very strong homogeneous discussions really polarize people effectively, as opposed to that effect that may have just by being exposed to convenient news. So having this, what we know, what the literature indicates, is that there are some disparity findings and some sort of inconsistent empirical findings, both based on survey and experiments, and you can see it all. We have findings in which they say that Democrats, they tend to have greater attitude polarization as opposed to Republicans. We also have some evidence that no, Republicans tend to be more likely to be polarized as opposed to Democrats. And we also have studies in which they claim that there are no effects, meaning neither Democrats or Republicans tend to be more polarized. They're equally polarized, or we have no effects at all in that regard. So, based on the literature, what we propose is that if individuals tend to be selectively exposed to news that aligns with their views, that should positively predict polarization. Similarly, when they discuss politics with people who think like them, and this homogeneous bubbles of political conversation will also positively predict affective polarization. But what we don't know so much, and we were here also interested based on that benchmark, first facilitating those two things and making sure that we found that the higher levels of selective exposure and discussion should predict affective polarization. Then we transition into those 48 bonds process between elections of what will happen in one society versus the other, right? A society in which media is not so influential and conversation not so influential versus a society where we have a strong effect society in which media and conversations should have a much more reinforcing power on individuals. So that's our research question one. Our research question two, on the other hand, is that what's the difference between parties? Within that time frame or between elections, again, in 48 months, would we have differences coming from or visible in one party and not another, or there are differences between Democrats and Republicans? And if so, if there are differences, where there be differences between Republicans and Democrats embedded in a minimal era society as opposed to a strong media effect society? So those are the things that we were testing with this study. In order to do that and to inoculate and regulate and compute the parameters for the interactions of our agents in the agent-based model, we wanted to provide some ground truth data for the initial standpoint and some of the calculations, meaning rather than just having everything randomized, we do have some data or use some data to provide some initial benchmark for agents to engage into interactions, right? So what we did is based on the survey research or survey data collected from a very diverse and representative sample of the U.S., we calculated the means of affective polarization. For instance, just the beginning, just to know what's the standpoint, or to take that as a standpoint of the beginning benchmark of how effective Republicans or Democrats may be. And here in this figure, you can see the distribution of the calibrated data set as a beginning standpoint when it comes to both discussion, news, and affective polarization. So what we did after first computing the arithmetic mean of the favorability rating that individuals will have for each party, you can see in there that the score of an overall score of affective polarization was calculated, and then there was a combination of either greater a party favorability or out party unfavorability, right? Similarly, what we did next is we created for each agent the news influence and the discussion influence. And there you have it, where you can have a very low influence. So you have all the four possibilities in there, right? Having a very low influence of the news versus a higher influence of the news. And the same for discussion, very low influence of the news versus a high influence of the news, right? So the news influence on polarization of each agent is set up exponentially distributed later on as a random floating number, which is what you see in there, right? How we calculated the news and also the discussion effects in each agent as they engage into interactions. Similarly, for the manipulation parameters, in here, what you can say is that we got both the global selective exposure and the global homogeneous rate, right? So for the global selective exposure rate of news consumption, what we did is to set the parameters as random numbers, as you can see in there, that can fluctuate from a 10% to a 90%. Which that will facilitate the variance across different ages. And we also set this up as a rate of interpersonal discussion. So having that, we can have a random floating number of how this will happen as agents interact. Then we proceeded with the rules. Here you have the rules. We listed the rules of interactions and how it will happen. So the number of links and the media and the discussion, and also how they'll be differently constructed both for Democrats and Republicans. And remember, when agents are interacting, this affects them. So forthcoming or subsequent interactions carry on a weight, right? And that's how we gain some effects of the process, better say. So these are the continuum of the rules as it's affecting polarization. This is what I was describing of how things will change in time as interactions proceed, and then whether they might be more easily influenced or not, depending on these interactions and how different media societies they were involved, and how different effects on the interactions themselves will affect the subsequent interactions. And then we update that at the level of affective polarization with each agent as being a function of that cross-cutting news exposure or consumption, as well as the discussion, which is this representation mathematical that you have in here. So let me go with the results as we're running out of time. And the first here, let's pay attention to that diagram in the middle that is highlighted in yellow. That is overexposed here on the right, so you can see the effect of that. And this table is a little bit complicated to understand, but not so much. What you can see is the months go from 0 to 48, which is the 4 years. That's what you can see on the horizontal bottom line. And then for each square, you will see on the left the level of affective polarization. That's denoted on the left side. And then on top, that's the selective exposure. That goes from none at all or very little, 0.1 to 0.9, 10% to 90%. And the one on the right is the same, that goes from 10% to 90%, 0.1 to 0.9, but that represents homogeneous discussion. So this one in the middle, literally, is the representation of a mid-level selective exposure of 0.5, a mid-level homogeneous discussion exposure of 0.5, and there you have the representation of affective polarization, how it goes over time. So although you see some variability, those are the green lines. The red line indicates that over time, when people are in a mid-range level of selective exposure and homogeneous discussion, the level of affective polarization in 4 years will decrease, which is very interesting news. Here, we'll focus on the top corners. So what you're seeing here is the highlighted 4 yellow corners are represented in this larger graph. And what you see in the one on top, the top left corner, you see in there how people have a low level, this is the scenario of low level selective exposure and high level of homogeneous discussion. And you can see the velocity of how affective polarization increases over time a little bit. And the opposite to that one would be the right bottom corner here, in which you have high levels of selective exposure and low levels of homogeneous discussion. And what you see over the time, over the period of 4 years, is that the effective polarization levels will decrease. Obviously, as one could interpret, and that was our hypothesis, you can clearly see that in the top right corner there, you see that both high levels of selective exposure to news and high levels of homogeneous discussion will reach the highest level of effective polarization over time. So when individuals, when agents cross the barrier of 10 months, is that when the highest effective polarization plateaus and is really, really high. Conversely, in the low selective exposure, low homogeneous discussion, you can clearly see that the opposite effect. After 10 months, people decrease their level of effective polarization to reach very low levels of effective polarization. So here we have a representation of a scenario of high influence of the news and high discussion influence. And the results are very interesting. You see once again, in the opposing corners, top right versus left bottom, that's the stream effects. So in the top right, high levels of selective exposure, high levels of homogeneous discussion, very ballistic, very rapidly. It only takes few months, 2-3 months, for people to get effectively polarized at the highest level, and they maintain that level for 4 years. Similarly, in the other one, it takes only 2 months or so for them to decrease the effective polarization, and the levels of effective polarization remain very low, nearly 1. I mean, 0 or 0.1, very, very low. There's some variability, and this is what the areas becomes very interesting, with some peaks and then reduction and increased levels and so on and so forth. So I invite you to pause the video and analyze the different graphs, particularly for some of the nuances between mid-ranges, high of one and mid-range of the other, for instance. So levels of high selective exposure to news and low homogeneous discussion to see what happens with some of the lines. But in the end, the main effect is what we discussed before, but here you can take a peek on the nuances. Very similarly here, these are the means of the corners as we discussed, so you can see that. This is on the top left corner, you see what I was describing of the peaking and then plateauing a little bit. But what becomes increasingly interesting is the idea that selective exposure to news is not so important as homogeneous discussion, as you can see in the graphs. And these are the differences between Republicans and Democrats. So very similar effect when it comes, although Democrats, they tend to have a little higher indication of effective polarization based on our survey data when they start. Over time, what happens is that Republicans, they become more polarized, more effectively polarized. Both in the left graph, you see the society of low media influence. On the right graph, you see the society of high influence. And once again, the results are first the main effects, what we discussed in the high media effect society, very ballistic effects. It takes no time, and people become really polarized. On the low level of low influence of media effects, it takes much more time, but people end up being polarized. Interesting here, though, is the idea. Excuse me. Interesting here, though, is the idea of the low level and the difference between Democrats and Republicans. And what we could see is that over time, Republicans become more polarized. Interesting is the graph of low discussion, low homogeneous discussion, and high influence of selective exposure. And what we see is that the discussion doesn't seem to have, even when it's not so homogeneous, when it's more diverse, doesn't seem to have helped the Republicans as long as they have high selective exposure. So for them, the selective exposure to news is really important, and the discussion doesn't help them that much. much. So those are the takeaway points that I would like to highlight before wrapping up, and it's just perfect timing. The first one is that homogeneous discussion overall, they play a bigger role than just selective exposure to information to predict affective polarization according to our agent-based modeling results. We also find that over time, individuals will become polarized no matter what. It doesn't matter if it's a strong society or a minimal effect society. They will take much longer in the minimal effect society as opposed to strong society. But over time, effective polarization, will increase once selective exposure to news and homogeneous discussions are present. It's just that the effects the time of the effects are distinct. But this puts some relevance to the idea of how much or how important it is to live in a minimal effect society versus a strong effect society. In the end, results according to the agent-based modeling and for this particular variable affective polarization are not that different. Ultimately, it's just how long it takes, but the effects are very similar. Then another take-home point is that affective polarization will increase much more, or the gap will increase much more for Republicans than for Democrats, and the Republicans will tend to get more affectively polarized over time. And as I say, the Democrats are more likely to consider moderate views and develop a little bit less animosity towards the opposing group. So that means that Republicans are not taking that much advantage of the beneficial cushion effects of having diverse discussions, particularly when selective exposure is present. So for Republicans, selective exposure, it's affecting them quite more than Democrats. Well, thank you very much for your attention. It's been an authentic pleasure again to participate of this international conference, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Please feel free to reach me out either via email or direct message via Twitter. And again, thanks for paying attention. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.